The rules of the game tonight are very simple. You can't criticize the sun. And your questions have to be directed to foreign policy. And when you do get to the microphone, you deliver a succinct question, if you will. I look forward to this evening with enormous anticipation. Jeff Price, the foreign editor, is going to chair the panel, and he will introduce each of the panelists.
These correspondents are here tonight to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the lands they cover, how America is viewed, and something about what the future may hold. And so I would like to introduce them. Second from your right is Bill Glauber. He is our London correspondent. He's been in London, lucky man, for the last going on 7 years. He covers Britain and Europe, where we have friends and enemies, and sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. He also covers the Balkans. He covered the American bombing of Yugoslavia. He covered the overthrow of Milosevic's party, and he was there when they took Milosevic to jail. I dare say it was one of his happier days. Sitting on Frank's right, sitting on Bill's right is Frank Langfitt, who covers China. China, obviously, is a place with which we must have a stable relationship, where we and they have issues which have made it perilously difficult. I'm sorry to do this in the order that I'm doing it, but I got a list here, and they're not sitting according to my list. Just give you an idea of how much I get abated. Sitting second from the left is Will Englund, who has actually started overseas before Bill did in London. He was in the Soviet Union, which it was then called, when the Soviet Union basically collapsed and communism along with it. And he has been reporting since then in 2 different tours on the staggering obstacles that confront that land and all of the former Soviet republics in the aftermath of the collapse of communism. John Murphy, who is sitting on Will's right, so you're far left. I don't know, is this crowd far left? Covers a vast continent of vast resources. He is our Johannesburg Bureau, covering a place beset by overwhelming obstacles that range from sheer primitivity to corruption, famine, disease, armed conflict, all of this going on while much of the developed world always seems to have its eye on another place. Mark Matthews, who is sitting to your right of Will Englund, has been covering foreign affairs for more than a decade. He spent several years as our diplomatic correspondent stationed in Washington. He is just completing his tour as the Middle East correspondent. So he's working in a place, as you all know, where the hope for peaceful coexistence seems to diminish with each day and each event, with each election and each ascension to power. Jay Hancock, who's sitting right next to me here, is our State Department correspondent, and he writes about what the administration does that helps these conditions to improve or deteriorate, and I must say he's had a busy time of it lately. Not that it's been any less busy under Bush than it was under Clinton, it's just a little different. I'm going to turn things over to these correspondents to start with Mr. Hancock, who's going to give us an idea of how things look from his point of view and how things may become in the future. Thank you very much.
George Bush has been in the White House for almost 4 months now. And while it's still early in his administration, he and his aides have given a fairly clear roadmap depicting where they want to go. at least projecting where they want to go. They're still conducting numerous important policy reviews. There's some key people, many key people that remain to be appointed. But they've given it's not too soon to sort of start taking stock and taking the size of the new president and his people. And the first thing that strikes me is the focus of the Bush administration's foreign policy. This is something they like to talk about. It was one of their main complaints, and not only from Republicans, about the Clinton administration, which was its lack of intellectual rigor, its sort of short attention span. And even though this is a selling point for the Bush people, I kind of buy into it. I think they really are more focused. There's a core philosophy that determines their policy specifics. And so far, the policy and the philosophy have been pretty much running in parallel. Now, it's still early, and that will probably change. Every new administration starts out with a clean slate and a very elegantly expressed philosophy, and sooner or later, real events intervene to either alter that philosophy a little bit or smash it to bits. So we'll see how far they can hold out. This is also an administration of very smart, very experienced grown-ups, I would describe them as. This is Donald Rumsfeld's second hitch as Defense Secretary. It's Paul Wolfowitz's second hitch as a top Pentagon deputy. He's Deputy Defense Secretary now. We all know about Colin Powell, but he's not just a war hero. He got a ton of foreign policy experience when he was in the Army and when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, is thought by some in Washington to be a bit of a lightweight, but I'm quite impressed by her. I think she's a really good thinker. And in fact, the main thing I want to do here is read you some excerpts of a piece she wrote for Foreign Affairs magazine more than a year ago, which has come to be thought of in Washington as sort of the Rosetta Stone of the new administration's foreign policy. It was sort of unnoticed at the time. It was unclear whether Bush would even get the nomination when she wrote it, and now people are going back and rereading it. I just want to read you a few of the phrases. It should give you a flavor of what they're thinking about and what they're trying to do. America must maintain a disciplined and consistent foreign policy that separates the important from the trivial. This is from Condoleezza Rice's article, again, from Foreign Affairs. The Clinton administration has assiduously avoided implementing such an agenda. Instead, every issue has been taken on its own terms, crisis by crisis, day by day. She's writing in the present tense about the Clinton people because obviously Clinton was still in the White House when this was written. Here's another excerpt. The belief that the United States is exercising power legitimately only when it is doing so on behalf of someone or something else was deeply rooted in Wilsonian thought, and there are strong echoes of it in the Clinton administration. Her essential argument is that you can do both. You can pursue the U.S. interest and improve things in the world at the same time. But she very clearly says that making the world a better place is not our first job. that our first job is looking after our own interests. And our own interests are defined fairly narrowly by these people. Here's another excerpt. Even those comfortable with notions of the national interest are still queasy with a focus on power relationships and great power politics. The reality is that a few big powers can radically affect international peace, stability, and prosperity. Great powers do not just mind their own business. Let me give you a couple other, and then I'll turn it over to Bill. America can exercise power without arrogance and pursue its interests without hectoring and bluster. When it does so in concert with those who share its core values, the world becomes more prosperous, democratic, and peaceful. That has been America's special role in the past, and it should be again as we enter the next century. This, I think, is going to be one of the more interesting tensions in the administration, is can they pursue U.S. interests as they see it and still not come off as arrogant? And so far, I don't think they've managed to do that. And Exhibit A is us getting kicked off the Human Rights Commission, as well as the rejection of Kyoto and some of the other things. And we can talk about those later if you would like. Feel free to ask me. Jeff, who's next?
Well, before you step down, I wonder if you would talk for a minute or two about the perception, at least among the press, about who's in charge of foreign policy, how it runs. I have in mind specifically the differences that seem to exist early on between Colin Powell, what he was saying on some issues, and what the administration or others in the administration were saying.
I think differences will emerge over time. I'm less convinced that there's a serious rift right now than some people in Washington are. Despite the glitches, Colin Powell is a very glib, very voluble, very talkative fellow, and sometimes he talks a little bit too much. I don't see the popular assumption in Washington is that there's going to be a feud between Powell and Rumsfeld, if there isn't already. That Powell is regarded as suspiciously soft by many on the right, and that there will be a power struggle between the Pentagon and the State Department for a very inexperienced president's attention and projection of power, with the vice president as a wild card. Cheney has some very hawkish, very hardline opinions on certain things. But he's also very pro-free trade and very uncomfortable with economic sanctions, particularly unilateral sanctions. And the assumption is that he will heed the wishes of his friends in the oil industry. And that does not always produce. The oil industry does not want an isolationist, hawkish, uniformly hardline stance.
One thing you have to know about what's going on in Europe right now is they're having a difficult time dealing with the new culture in Washington. Europeans actually liked Bill Clinton. I think the reason they liked him was because he could put a sentence together. He was charismatic, and like their own politicians, he had a woman problem. The other thing I think you need to know about what's going on in Europe is their perception of the United States. I mean, if you read the British newspapers, you'd think that we're nothing but a bunch of fat, gun-crazed, television-obsessed Bible thumpers, to which I always say, hey, I don't own a gun. So what's happening is... So I think that the culture is changing, and Europe is always going to be far to the left of the United States, whether there is a Republican or a Democratic administration in Washington. A couple of examples. The planned execution of Tim McVeigh was really going to annoy Europeans because in the EU there are no executions anymore. The killing of the Kyoto Treaty, which was really dead anyway, was a very symbolic message that the United States was sending to the Europeans, which is basically butt out of our oil, and the Europeans didn't like that. The United States also is very kind of wishy-washy about what they want Europe to do militarily. They want more from Europe, but then Europe comes up with what's called the European Defense Initiative, which is a force of some 60,000 men. And so the United States got a little nervous about that. But the truth is that there really is no rapid reaction force. And the other thing is the United States could probably ask Europe is, please, show us your planes. The whole thing doesn't exist. So I think that there will always be these tensions, and they're somewhat cyclical, and we're probably in an anti-American feeling in parts of Europe now that I think will probably, by mid-June, will bubble up because George Bush is scheduled to come over there and meet with the European leaders at that time. So it's actually a very interesting time in Europe, and I think that Europe will grow accustomed to George W. Bush, and they will learn why he does have popularity here, and they may even learn to like a guy who wears cowboy boots.
Could you talk about Yugoslavia for a minute with respect to a couple of things? What do you see as the prognosis for Serbia? And what do you make of what's going on in Macedonia? How dangerous is it? How much could it fly out of hand to the point where pressure starts coming on the United States to become aggressively involved?
I don't think that Macedonia is going to get out of hand. I think there will be skirmishes. But this is going to get a little bit complex and turned around. But let me go back a few years to 1996, 1997, when pyramid schemes in Albania collapsed the country. Now, what happened at that point was Albanians got really angry. And when they got really angry, what did they do? They decided to break in to the armed outposts and steal all the weapons. So there were a lot of AK-47s running around Tirana, more than usual. You could buy them for about $20. A couple of years later, those AK-47s got into Kosovo and helped the KLA take on the Serb paramilitaries. And then, all of a sudden, the United States got involved. Now, those weapons are still around, but you can go back 3-4 years and see how those weapons and the collapse of that pyramid scheme created the first Allied bombing of Europe in 50 years. And you don't think of these things, but it happens. But I think that Macedonia will be solved eventually, and I think for a couple of reasons. There are about 30,000, 40,000 peacekeepers in Kosovo itself right now, and they will be able to, if not cut off the arms and the men going back and forth, they'll make it difficult. And I think that there will be some sort of political settlement in Macedonia, which now has a coalition government of both ethnic Albanians and Slavs. So I think that that will be solved. As for Serbia, I believe that they will eventually right themselves. It's going to be a very difficult time with their economy. But you know, they're coming out of 10, 15 years of being utterly hemorrhaged. And it's kind of a strange place to be in, because I'll give you an example. A day or two after Milosevic was arrested, remember, it was like Long Day's Journey into Night meets the Balkans. You know, he's drunk, the wife is drunk, the daughter's waving guns around. They finally took him away. Anyway, a couple of days after that, I spoke with Zoran Đinđić, who's the prime minister of Serbia. And it's not often that you can talk to a prime minister about state-sponsored terrorism, state-sponsored assassination, gun running. And I asked him about, the past, and we talked about that. And then I asked, so when you had the standoff with Milosevic, were you prepared to level the villa? He says, oh, yes, definitely. And then I asked, so were you prepared to, kill Milosevic? He says, oh, absolutely. And then I asked him about Milosevic's being in prison and, the history of suicide in his family. And so somebody asked Gingic if, considering that suicide does run in Milosevic's family, did they have the former president of Yugoslavia on suicide watch? To which Gingic looked at us in utter astonishment and said, why?
I want to talk a little bit about China recently because it's really been in the news. The last month, I guess April was extremely exciting. It began on April Fool's Day, as I think many of you know, when a U.S. spy plane collided with a Chinese jet over the South China Sea, and the People's Liberation Army held 24 crew members for 11 days until China, having asked for an apology for those days, never actually got it, but eventually had to capitulate. It wasn't much longer after that that George Bush announced that the U.S. would be making the largest weapons sale to Taiwan in about 9 years, which involved submarines, destroyers, and anti-submarine planes. And a day or two after that, he goes on Good Morning America and seems to scrap the ambiguity in our Taiwan policy, saying that the United States is willing and ready to defend Taiwan if attacked. And as a reporter, I think many of the reporters and the diplomats, both in the Chinese and the Americans in Beijing, were just exhausted from writing all these stories and negotiating all these things, and we were all glad to have a rest. And around this time, my mother gave me a phone call because she's actually coming out to visit with my father next week. And she was really concerned about U.S.-China relations and said, should we still think about coming? And I said, it's okay, Mom, you don't have to worry about it. This is just sort of the normal ups and downs of the relationship. And this is more and more of what we're going to see all the time, and we all, frankly, need to get used to it. But I could understand why my mother was concerned, because sometimes as I read some of the headlines, never those in the Sun, but in other publications, I could see how people get a little worried. And I picked up one from a magazine that had 4 destroyers sailing across the ocean straight at the camera with, in big letters, "The New Cold War." And I sort of found that really unhelpful for readers because the Cold War is long over. And China, for all of its differences that it has with America, and for the threats that it may or may not present to America, is certainly not the Soviet Union. The relationship between the two is very different. I think the Soviet Union and America had many, many differences economically, ideologically, and politically. And China and the US, while they don't agree politically on many things, they have enormous economic ties now and trade. There are 40 to 50,000 Chinese students right now here in the United States. And also, whereas the Soviet Union posed a threat militarily, a genuine threat to the United States, China's military is still very weak. I don't know whether you've ever heard this, but when China will threaten to invade Taiwan, which is, of course, just 100 miles off the mainland, the Taiwanese often refer to that idea as the million-man swim, because it's very unlikely that the People's Liberation Army would get very far off the beach in that sort of invasion. Of course, when George Bush came to office, he referred to China as a strategic competitor, and President Clinton earlier had seen China as potentially a strategic partner. And as we look, I want to echo some of Jay's thoughts here. Presidents often come into office taking a very hard line on China, but find that over time they need to moderate that and develop a working relationship. And I think it's worth remembering that in 1992, when President Clinton was running for office, he was running, of course, against President George Bush Sr., and said, I will not be coddling dictators from Baghdad to Beijing. And 6 years later, he was standing on Tiananmen Square with Chinese President Jiang Zemin, lauding a new relationship. So I think that as we look forward, I think that we need to get used to the fact that this is going to be an up and down relationship, and we shouldn't get too frightened about it. I think we should be very concerned about China. We should pay a lot of attention. But it's certainly none of the events, most of the events that occur certainly shouldn't affect our travel plans.
Two Russians are walking down the street, run into each other. One of them, this, by the way, is not a joke, so I don't want to raise your expectations. Two Russians are walking down the street. They bump into each other. One of them, they meet each other, and one will say to the other, you know, how are you going? How's it going? How are you doing? And the second one will say, if you translated his words directly from Russian to English, literal translation, nothing, normal. He might have just won the lottery. He might have just wrecked his car and killed his dog, but the answer is going to be nothing, normal. Why tempt fate, you know? What do you gain by saying anything more revealing than that? I've now learned that when Jeff calls me from Baltimore and asks, what are you writing tonight? I can tell him, nothing, normal. And why tempt fate, you know? I've come to think of this as a way of thinking about Russia in a sort of a larger sense as well, you know. What does the future hold for Russia? Nothing. Normal. You can also read it another way, though. Nothing normal. I don't know. When I first came to Russia, I was, I think, a very typical American of that era, which was some time ago. I was a great optimist, you know. Reform was going to move ahead. There would be bumps in the road. There would be problems, but things were going in the right direction. There was progress. There was the beginnings of democracy, rule of law, jury trials. McDonald's was opening. How could things possibly deteriorate from there? And I didn't understand it when my Russian friends didn't understand me. And then came 1998, and the government defaulted on its debts, the ruble collapsed, everything looked just awful. And the scales fell from my eyes, and I became a pessimist about Russia. It was clear the country was headed quickly apart. Everything was going to go wrong. I felt a sadder but wiser correspondent. Of course, in the year that followed the collapse of the ruble, industrial production went up, wage arrears were paid off, the economy improved, the budget got better. As I was bending over trying to pick up the scales to put them back on my eyes, it occurred to me that I had the wrong approach entirely. Russia isn't going anywhere, I finally realized. Russia just is. It has its fluctuations, has its good times, its bad times, but Russia just is. Nothing. Normal. Now I understand what my friends in Russia are talking about. Nothing normal. Well, even in a state of isness, depending how you define is, I guess, there's, it might be, things can fluctuate. I'd just like to sort of look back at the past year. At the last meeting, a little over a year ago, you had the pleasure of having Kathy Lally from our bureau here instead of me, but I'll do what I can. This past year, of course, has been the year of Vladimir Putin, who showed, having been in 1995 for Ted Turner, when Ted Turner came to visit St. Petersburg, his driver was Vladimir Putin. He showed us all that Russia indeed is the land of opportunity, as long as you have a background in the KGB. This has been a year when Putin has brought the press very much to heel, and I think Russia is the poorer for that. It was the year when the Kursk submarine sank. This was a tremendous blow to the Russians. The Navy spent most of the next 2 months after the sinking of the Kursk, blaming a foreign submarine, a foreign vessel of some kind had collided. There was never a shred of evidence, but it made a good story. Putin himself kept silent for quite a long time, and when he finally did speak about it, he blamed the press for sinking the Kursk. Shortly after the Kursk sank, there was a fire at the huge television tower in Moscow, the Ostankino Tower, knocking out television. Putin didn't blame the press for that. In fact, my Russian friends tell me that a commission later found that the cause of the Ostankino disaster was that it had collided with a foreign TV tower. This has been a year when Russians learned to trust their own beef more than anybody else's. A year when I had the pleasure of seeing a former rocket fuel thermos being used to store Russian champagne, which I'm quite fond of. And I would say Jeff is somewhat less fond of. It was also a year when 20 soldiers per week, Russian soldiers per week, died in Chechnya, a fight that Putin capitalized on, at the very least, and now drags on and on and on with no particular end in sight, but a fight that is awfully lucrative for those Russian officers who happen to be in a position to divert supplies, steal oil that goes through pipelines nearby, even take part in kidnappings of Chechens. And also the sale of Russian munitions to the people who are fighting the Russians. That is also a very lucrative business. It was a year when Putin, who I might add whose name the French are forced to mispronounce, because if they gave it the usual French pronunciation, it would be a very indelicate kind of thing to have to say, began taking more and direct interest in the countries surrounding Russia, discovering that the United States has already gained a fair amount of influence in places like Central Asia and in the Caucasus, I mean the southern Caucasus, Azerbaijan and Georgia. The Russians don't like that. They've woken up to the situation. Whereas in years past, the Russians used to threaten their neighbors with arms, with guns. They threatened the Georgians that way. They used to get into these little spats with the Ukrainians over the Black Sea Fleet, and there would be maybe a little skirmishing here and there. They've gotten much more sophisticated about it, and they're now using, under Putin, and they're now using economic levers against their neighbors, which are proving quite effective. This is a year when Russian analysts said that when Bush came into office, there was going to be a lot of very tough talk about Russia. And they expected that. And they expected that over time, as my colleagues have talked about, over time, that talk would moderate. The administration would realize it had to deal with Russia. They're still expecting that. It was a year when former head of the Kremlin Property Department, a guy named Pavel Borodin, spent 3 months in Brooklyn, New York as a guest of the US government. When he was finally extradited to Switzerland, the Swiss immediately let him go. But he's actually back for questioning right now. I would say that when I came to Russia as a un-Russified American, it was a time of optimism, and your typical American was a smiling, optimistic kind of person. Now it's very fashionable to be very pessimistic about Russia, among those who haven't traveled down the same path as I have. And things you can make the place look awful. You can make the future of the place, your projections of the future of the place look terrible. I would just point out, in my sense of isness, that Russia is a country that in not our own century, the previous century, went through a revolution, a civil war, and a famine, and then a man-made famine, and then mass purges, And then an invasion by the most powerful army in the world at that time, which pushed all the way to the Volga and occupied half of the European portion of Russia by November, December of 1942. I would say that was a Russia that had gone through more than today's Russia has. And 2.5 years later, they were in Berlin putting the red flag on the Reichstag. So I think that's something to keep in mind. A recent article came out in the Atlantic magazine by a guy named Jeffrey Taylor, provocatively entitled, "Is Russia Finished?" And I couldn't help thinking of that old joke about New York. You know, New York will be a great place if they ever get it finished. I was thinking, Russia will be a hell of a wreck if they ever get it finished. Fortunately, I think for the Russians and for us, I don't think Russia ever will be finished. As the Russians would say, nothing, normal. Ничего, нормально.
Up here on this podium last year, I predicted that Bill Clinton would secure a peace agreement in the Middle East before he left office. I was young and foolish at the time. But that really raises a question, how the United States, with its unparalleled influence in that region, perhaps as much influence as it has anywhere, was able to let this slip through its fingers. And I think there are a number of reasons, but there are some clear lines that you can draw. The United States, at the end of the Gulf War in 1991, had basically removed the major obstacles to its influence in the area. It had won a war against Iraq. The Soviet Union was dead and almost not a factor anymore. And the United States took on the task of trying to bring peace between Israelis and Arabs on its own, and desiring to keep everybody else out. Both sides resented the United States, but also welcomed it and knew that they had no other choice in the matter. Israelis view the United States fundamentally as a security blanket. They know that when the chips are down, the United States is their friend, and they don't quite trust anybody else. And even though they're a regional superpower, nuclear power, have the strongest military in the region, they still don't feel safe. Among the Arabs, the United States is generally viewed as all-powerful, a force against which even terrorists, even Iraq, are pitifully small. This explains sometimes how strange they are in their refusal to condemn acts of terrorism that occur in their own backyard. They tend to believe that whoever is standing up to the United States is waging a good struggle, and more power to him. This goes even for those who don't like the acts that are committed. We don't see too much sign of how awestruck the Arab states and the Palestinians are by the United States, because these regimes don't allow very much dissent. But I think in recent months we've seen a couple of glimmers of it. Riots in Jordan, also riots in Egypt. The United States is approaching the point, I think, where its role in the region is in a state of crisis. Martin Indyk used to say that the United States had 4 interests in the Middle East: oil, 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 and Israel. Sometimes we tend to think of these as mutually exclusive, as interests that threaten to cancel each other out. I think, personally, they're inseparable. If Israel is not secure, and if there's no progress towards stability in the region, then American oil sources are not going to be secure, and the region is going to continue to be a tinderbox that could drag us in. What happened between Oslo and Camp David? At Oslo, I think Bill Clinton was kind of handed a gift. He was assigned the role of godfather to take the outlines of a peace agreement and to try to push it forward towards something lasting. And I certainly, and I think many of my colleagues, didn't see the danger signs for what they were. Somehow they got almost to the edge of an agreement, and then the whole thing dissolved into a far bloodier, more hate-filled conflict than any of us could have expected. And the reason is that although they were close to an agreement last year, and even after Camp David, they still continued to make incremental progress towards an agreement. Israelis and Palestinians, and Israelis and the Arab world never got close to real peace. Real peace means addressing each other's fears and addressing each other's needs to have their rights recognized and their existence recognized. It's as much a psychological challenge as it is a challenge for land, and it's a huge challenge for land. These are 2 traumatized populations, and everything they do to each other now is just added to what's been done to both of them in the past, and the wound just keeps getting deeper and deeper. And what we're now seeing is daily reminders of how deep that wound is and how raw it still is. Neither population has had any chance to heal. I think the United States could have taken a far more active approach in trying to heal some of those wounds after Oslo, and in that way made the process towards the very difficult compromises that both sides would have to make a little bit easier. With the Israelis, to help the Israelis, I think the United States could have been far more active on finding a solution to the Palestinian problem. This is almost an existential fear among the Israelis, because if the Palestinians were to return to the State of Israel, many of them feel that the State of Israel would no longer exist. It boggles the mind how several million people could be spread out around the world, many hundreds of thousands of them living in pretty wretched refugee camps all over the Arab world, and so little has been done for them over the years. The Arab states themselves take a lot of the blame for this. There's great propaganda value in keeping a large population of refugees destitute and hopeless. But I don't think the United States had to absorb that line. Had many of them seen an opportunity to educate their children, to move to the West, to resettle, to build new lives, the dimensions of the refugee problem could have been shrunken. And that would have been a much easier solution to reach. The other area where the United States could have pushed was on Jerusalem. For 7 years, Jerusalem was supposed to be a taboo subject. Nothing was supposed to be said or done about Jerusalem until the final status negotiations. Well, this may have been a taboo subject for the Israelis and the Palestinians, but that doesn't mean it was taboo for the United States. And had the United States been offering practical solutions, gotten people talking about them, gotten arguments to flare and then dissipate, the enormous problem of Jerusalem with its ethnic and religious dimension could have been reduced to something a little bit more manageable. The United States has always had pretty clear principles about the Middle East, but in recent years it seems to have strayed from them. It has always said that United Nations resolutions, the Land for Peace resolutions, are the basis for any lasting settlement. They seldom say what that actually ought to mean. The United States has continually opposed the expansion of settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, but has done really very little to curtail them, has kind of paid lip service to the problem over the past 7 years, and as a result, the expansion continues, and even though for many Israelis these are merely bargaining chips, they are bargaining chips involving human lives, and they're bargaining chips where the other side sees their eventual state being eaten away. And now a lot of young families and children are pretty much on the front lines there, living there, hoping to stay for their future, and under almost daily assault. The Palestinian Authority came into being with great hopes. A lot of Palestinians that you talk to desperately want to become part of a democracy. Instead, what's turned out is kind of a mini Egypt, an autocratic state with military courts that hold trials in secret that last half an hour to an hour, and then people can be jailed, in some cases executed. There is little respect for human rights within the Palestinian Authority. There is a small elite that over the past 5 to 7 years got rich on trading with Israel, while the bulk of the population, through series of opening and closing of the West Bank and Gaza saw their standard of living drop. By the time they got around to final status negotiations, I think the Palestinian people were very much fed up with their own government, fed up with the lack of anything approaching independence, sovereignty, continued seeing Israelis as dominating so many areas of their existence. But instead of turning their frustration on their own leadership, they were almost handed an opportunity to turn the frustration against the Israelis. And that is part of the conflict that we're now seeing. It's clear to me that there were opportunities over the past 5 to 7 years that were missed, routes that ought to have been pursued that were not. The Bush administration is inheriting a problem that's as bad as it's been perhaps in the last 2 decades, and it doesn't promise to get any better. The two leaders involved are both more comfortable with conflict, have far more experience in pursuing conflict than they have in pursuing peace.
When Jeff asked me to talk about American relations with Africa, actually the first thing that came to mind is a member of our local community, and that is Hasim the Rock Rockman, who just last month was very much celebrated in South Africa after winning the World Heavyweight Championship over Lennox Lewis. And on one hand, that's just a very simple event, just a sporting event, but you can't overstate the importance that event had to many South Africans. They, as Jeff mentioned, Africans feel very overlooked, forgotten, and to have an event like that in their backyard really meant a lot. And also, it's very important how people really fell in love with Hasim Rockman, and Baltimore had a great ambassador over there. They really did fall in love with him. I'd like to start off with just a brief quote, and you may recognize this. While Africa may be important, it doesn't fit into national strategic interests as far as I can see them. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't have rallied folks such as the United Nations to go help keep warring parties apart in Rwanda, but at some point in time, the president has got to clearly define what is in our interests. And that was then candidate George W. Bush in February 2000. And that, when he said that, that generated a lot of criticism in many quarters of his lack of an African policy. I'd just like to begin there tonight because it does raise an interesting question of why we should care about Africa. And when I go about reporting, that's always a question I have in the back of my mind. Why should someone care about the story I'm writing? Because on many days it seems irrelevant to much of the world. We're preoccupied with other areas. So I'd just like to just give you a few things to think about maybe over the next year of what maybe are some American interests. And the first of those is oil. We now depend on Africa for 15% of our oil in the United States. And some experts say that will increase to over 25% in the next 10 to 15 years. One thing that recently occurred, I reported on last year, was the pipeline running from Chad through Cameroon to the Atlantic coast being built primarily by ExxonMobil. And that'll produce over the next 25 years some 25 billion gallons of oil, or not gallons, barrels of oil. A second issue to look at is trade, and there's very, very little trade going on between the African continent and the United States. But the Clinton administration passed the African Growth and Opportunity Act, and that is will be kicking in over the next year or two. And so you may find that when you go to the store and especially buy clothing, that it may have the little label on it, made in Swaziland or maybe made in Lesotho. So that's something else to look for. And finally, is the issue of humanitarian aid. And I think when you mention Africa, that's probably what most people think of all the tragedy there, all the pain and suffering. And what is America's role in trying to heal, trying to solve some of these problems? Much of the 770 million people living on the continent live on less than $1 a day, and that's something that still is very shocking to me. And finally, there's the issue of AIDS. The continent has 70% of all the world's cases of HIV/AIDS, some 25 million people. And you've probably heard a lot about President Thabo Mbeki, South African President Thabo Mbeki, and he has wrestled with this issue of whether HIV causes AIDS, and that, I think in many people's opinion, really set the country back, because you're dealing in South Africa with a population that many people doubt whether HIV/AIDS is actually a disease. Many people think they die from other things. When you go to funerals in places like Soweto, and it's very, very clear the person is maybe 25, 30 years old, and it's clear to everyone that that person died of AIDS. When you ask the family members, well, what happened? They said, oh, well, they were just sick. And you ask, well, was it AIDS? And they said, oh, no. And so I think by having President Thabo Mbeki question whether AIDS actually exists, that wasn't the best thing for South Africans. And you probably all, another thing recently in the news was the AIDS drug trial. And the government, viewed that as a victory. They will now be able to get drugs for close to nothing, some $300 a year for the what's called the triple cocktail therapy, the antiretrovirals. But what was really interesting, and just one final thing to look out for this year, is that even though they may get these drugs for free, there is no infrastructure in many parts of South Africa and the entire continent to treat people, to deliver the drugs, the much needed drugs. So I'm sorry to add to end on a sad note, but that is the next challenge I think you'll be reading a lot about in the year to come.